The afternoon sun fell across the gates of Ashbourne Manor like gold, poured from a great height, warm, generous, and completely indifferent to the ugliness unfolding just beyond its iron bars. Clara Weston noticed the gates before she noticed anything else. They were shut. Not locked, not gently closed shut, the way a door is slammed in someone's face. A chain looped loosely through the bars, and a sheet of paper had been nailed to the left post with such force that the nail had bent. She stepped closer and read it. Notice of sale. 2 words. 3 syllables. And yet they seemed to carry the weight of generations. She had come for a teaching position. She had answered an advertisement, placed in the County Gazette, 3 weeks prior, that promised a modest wage, a private room, and the company of a well-read household. Clara was 27, practical by necessity and romantic by nature, and she had learned long ago to dress her hope in sensible shoes before setting out into the world. She had not expected to arrive and find the world already on fire. From beyond the gates, she heard a voice. It was not raised, it did not need to be. The kind of cruelty that man practiced did not need volume, it needed precision, and he had it in abundance. You will sign the papers today, madam. There is no further room for negotiation. The estate is insolvent. The creditors are circling, and frankly, your continued resistance is an embarrassment to the family name you claim to protect. Clara's hand stilled on the gate. She looked through the iron bars and saw 2 figures standing on the stone path that curved toward the manor's front entrance. One was a man in a dark suit, impeccable in his tailoring and devastating in his posture. He held a document in his right hand and gestured with it as though it were a weapon. His features were sharp, composed, the kind of face that had learned early in life to show nothing it did not intend to show. The other was a woman. She was elderly, silver-haired, dressed entirely in black, as though she were already in mourning for something she refused to let die. Her posture was extraordinary, straight-backed, head lifted, chin level, the posture of someone who had stood against many storms, and had simply decided that bending was not in her vocabulary. But her eyes, even from this distance, carried the unmistakable weight of someone being slowly, deliberately ground down. She was not breaking, but she was being asked to. And Clara Weston, who had survived enough of her own humiliations to recognize one happening to someone else, opened the gate and walked through. She did not plan what she said next. She did not rehearse it, did not weigh it against consequence, did not consider the fact that she was a stranger here, a governess candidate without even a confirmed appointment, stepping into a dispute that had nothing to do with her. She simply walked up behind the man in the dark suit, looked at the paper in his hand, and said calmly and clearly, "I believe you are speaking to a lady. You may wish to adjust your tone." The man turned, the elderly woman turned, and somewhere deep in the ancient stones of Ashbourne Manor, something shifted the way tectonic plates shift before an earthquake, slowly and then all at once. Clara did not know it yet, but she had just changed the course of her life entirely. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. Clara Weston had been moving through the world on a combination of careful savings, borrowed confidence, and a single brown leather trunk since she was 19 years old. She had grown up the daughter of a schoolteacher in a market town that smelled of bread and river water, and when her father died quietly, apologetically, the way gentlemen often do, she had packed everything she owned into that trunk and gone to find work. She had been a teacher's assistant, a companion to an elderly widow in Bath, a reader for a half-blind countess in Edinburgh, who had paid her in books more often than coins. She was not unhappy, but she admitted to herself on long evenings, a little lonely. The advertisement for Ashbourne Manor had appeared in the Gazette on a Tuesday. By Thursday she had written her letter of application. By Friday She had stopped telling herself. It was merely practical, and admitted that the phrase well-read household had caught somewhere tender in her chest, and held on. The coach from the village left her at the end of the lane. The driver, a broad man with a weathered face and an opinion about everything, had shaken his head slowly as he handed down her trunk. "You're going to the manor," he said. "I have an appointment," Clara said, which was technically true. The driver looked at her for a long moment. "There's been trouble up there," he said. "Legal sort of trouble, the kind that men in good suits make for people who can't fight back." He paused. "I'm just saying." "Thank you," Clara said, and picked up her trunk and walked. The lane to Ashbourne Manor was lined with old oaks, the kind that had been growing since before anyone currently alive had been born. Their canopy was thick and green, and the light that fell through it was dappled and kind. Clara walked beneath them and felt for a moment that the world was still capable of being beautiful. Then she reached the gates and read the notice. She stood there long enough to read it twice. The language was cold, legal, and finally the vocabulary of men who had decided that an outcome was inevitable, and were simply informing the world of that fact. The estate of Ashbourne, historically held in trust under the Ashbourne Ducal Charter of 1742, was to be surrendered for public auction on the 23rd of the month, pending the formal relinquishment of all hereditary rights by the current titleholder. Pending relinquishment. As though relinquishment were a given, as though the woman who lived here had already agreed to vanish. Clara pushed through the gate and heard that cold, precise, merciless voice, and she followed it to its source. And she found the scene she had described to no one, because no one had yet asked her, and she opened her mouth and said the words that changed everything. The confrontation. The man who turned to face her was named Aldous Crane. Clara did not know this yet. She only knew that he was somewhere in his mid-40s, that his coat was cut by someone expensive, and that his expression, when he saw her, moved through surprise into contempt. With the speed of a man who had long ago decided that most people were not worth his time. "And you are," he said. "I am someone who heard the conversation you were having," Clara said, "and who would like to suggest, respectfully, that the way you are speaking to this lady is not acceptable." There was silence. The elderly woman in black said nothing. She was watching Clara with an expression. Clara could not immediately read somewhere between astonishment and the very faint, very controlled beginning of something that might, eventually, become relief. "This does not concern you," Aldous Crane said. "Perhaps not," Clara said. "But I find when I witness a person being spoken to as though they are an inconvenience, rather than a human being, that standing quietly feels something like cowardice. And I have enough small cowardices to account for already, without adding more." Crane stared at her. His jaw was very slightly tight. "I am a solicitor," he said. "I represent a consortium of creditors with legitimate legal claims against this estate." "You are a passerby," Clara said, "who has nonetheless observed that you have been waving that document at this woman as though it were a blunt instrument. If the law is on your side, Mr. Crane, Mr. The law is on your side, then the law will do its work without you raising your voice or reducing a gentlewoman to the object of your impatience. Don't you think so?" Another silence, this one longer. Then the elderly woman in black said very quietly, "My name is Margaret Ashbourne." A pause. "And I think, young woman, that you have just done me the first genuine kindness I have received in some months." Clara looked at her. "I'm Clara Weston. I came for a teaching position." "Did you?" The woman's silver eyes moved slowly over Clara's face, the way one might read. A letter one had been waiting a very long time to receive. "Then I think the position may be filled, though perhaps not in the way either of us expected." Aldous Crane tucked his document under his arm. "This is not finished," he said. His voice was flat and certain, the way walls are certain. The auction proceeds. Whatever theatrical interruptions occur between now and then, he left. His footsteps on the stone path were precise and unhurried, the walk of a man who believed that the world arranged itself according to his schedule. Clara watched him go. Then she turned back to Margaret Ashbourne, Dowager Duchess of the estate that bore her name, and extended her hand. "Shall we go inside?" Clara said. "I suspect we have a great deal to discuss." Inside Ashbourne Manor, the grandeur was undeniable, and the decline was equally so. The entrance hall was enormous vaulted ceilings with plasterwork that had once been painted and now showed its age, great stone fireplaces cold even in the warmth of the afternoon, portraits hanging on walls that had been stripped of half their smaller decorations, the pale squares on the wallpaper marking where things had once hung and been removed, the kind of removal that happened not through choice but through necessity. The Dowager Duchess walked ahead of Clara with that extraordinary posture, back straight, head lifted, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, "Tea, I think." The kitchen is still functional. Most things, at least, are still functional. They sat in a small parlour off the main corridor. The furniture was good old and beautiful, and clearly unmoved from its positions in decades, but there was a quietness to the room that spoke of a house that had grown very used to its own company, a house where the echoes had stopped expecting to be filled. Margaret Ashbourne poured the tea herself. Her hands were steady and practiced, and she performed the ritual with the ease of someone who had once done it for 100 guests and now did it for one. "You are braver than you look," she said. "That is a compliment. You look perfectly competent." "Crane didn't frighten me," Clara said, which was only partly true. Men who talk like that are usually frightened of something themselves. The Duchess looked at her sharply. "That is a perceptive thing to say. My father was a schoolteacher," he said. "The loudest voice in a room is usually the most afraid." I have found it to be generally accurate. Margaret was quiet for a moment. The tea sat between them, its steam rising gently. Outside the windows, the gardens were still beautiful, a little overgrown, perhaps, the hedgerows wanting trimming, the roses running slightly wild but beautiful, the kind of beauty that persists without permission. "Aldous Crane is a solicitor," the Duchess said at last. "That much is true. He represents creditors. That also is true. What is not true is the claim that I have agreed to surrender this estate. I have not signed anything. I have not relinquished anything. And yet he has produced documents suggesting otherwise, and I have been informed by no fewer than 3 separate legal representatives that the signatures upon those documents bear a very strong resemblance to my own hand." Clara set down her cup. "Forged. That is the word that no one has yet been willing to say to me directly," Margaret said. "Yes, forged." The word sat in the room with them. Outside, a bird called once and then went quiet. "Is there no one to help you?" Clara asked. "Family?" The Duchess's expression shifted only slightly, only briefly, but Clara saw it. The complex, careful grief of a woman who had learned to carry a particular wound for so long that she no longer mentioned it in polite company. "I have a son," Margaret said. "He has been away. We have been estranged. It is a long story and not, I think, the most pressing matter at this moment. He doesn't know. He knows what I have told him, which is," she paused, "very little. We have not spoken as we should have. Pride is an expensive thing, Miss Weston. It tends to compound interest." Clara thought about her own history of silences, of letters not written, of words left unspoken because the moment had passed. And then the moment had passed too many times, and the silence had become the relationship. She understood what the Duchess was not saying. "What do the documents look like?" Clara asked. The ones Crane presented. "Legal papers. Stamped. Sealed. The seal is the estate seal with a particular impression, a boar's head with a crown, very old, very specific." She paused. "I have not been able to examine them closely, because Crane has not permitted me to hold them for more than a moment. He is very careful about that. He is very careful about that. Clara filed this away. She filed everything away. It was a habit from childhood. Her father's influence, the sense that details were not incidental, but essential. That the world revealed its character in what it tried, hide as much as in what it showed. "I would like to see the library," Clara said. "If that is possible." The Duchess raised an eyebrow. "You are thorough." "I am trying to be useful," Clara said. "That was, after all, why I came here." Margaret Ashbourne regarded her for a long moment. Then something in her face which had been, until now, composed in the practiced restraint of long-exercised dignity, softened, just slightly like wax near a flame. "Yes," she said, "I believe it was. Come then, I will show you the library, and while I do, I will tell you everything." The plot in Shadow's Aldous Crane, meanwhile, did not go far. He went as far as the east wing of the manor grounds, where a carriage waited in the shade of the old oak trees, and where a woman in pale blue lace stood with her back to the grounds, and her face tilted upward, wearing the particular expression of someone calculating. Her name was Vivienne Ashbourne. She was the Duke's younger sister, estranged from the family in her own way, though for entirely different reasons than her brother and she was wearing pearl earrings that had belonged to their mother, and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "She didn't sign," Crane said, his voice clipped. "I didn't expect her to sign today," Vivienne said. "That was never the plan. The plan is the auction. We have a date. We have the documents. The only thing we need now is to ensure that no one looks too closely at the paperwork before the gavel falls." "There was a woman," Crane said, "a stranger." She appeared at the gates and inserted herself into the conversation. Vivienne turned then, slowly, with the careful grace of someone who had been trained from birth to make every movement appear effortless. She looked at Crane with eyes that were pale and sharp and utterly without warmth. "What sort of woman?" "Young, dark-haired, not from here, said she came for a teaching position." "A governess candidate." Vivienne considered this. "She is nobody." She spoke with confidence. "Many nobodies do," Vivienne said. "It is how they survive." She turned back to the grounds. "Watch her, but do not engage. We are too close to the end to create new problems." Crane nodded. He looked back toward the manor's front entrance, where the notice of sale still hung on the gate, bending very slightly in the afternoon breeze. "And the Duke?" he said. A pause. "My brother," Vivienne said very carefully, "will arrive when he arrives. He always does. But he will arrive too late, as he always does. That," she said, "is the one thing about Marcus I have always been able to rely upon." The library at Ashbourne Manor was the finest room in the house, and also, clearly, the most loved. Every other room showed its strain. The cold fireplaces, the absent ornaments, the wallpaper a shade too faded. But the library had been maintained with something close to ferocity. The shelves were full and orderly. The volumes were dusted. The two large reading tables were polished to a shine that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in warm amber shapes across the floor. The smell of old paper and leather, and something faintly floral lavender, Clara thought, perhaps from dried sprigs tucked between volumes, was the smell of a room that had been cared for consistently and deliberately by someone who understood that not decoration but necessity. Clara ran her fingers along a shelf and felt something loosen in her, some tension she had been carrying since the gate, since the coach, since the grey Tuesday morning when she had read an advertisement and decided to believe in it. "You love this room," she said. "I have spent more hours in it than I have spent sleeping," Margaret said from the doorway. "My husband was a reader. He believed that a library was not a collection of books, but a collection of conversations. Every volume a voice, and the room itself a kind of gathering. I could not agree more." Clara turned. "Tell me about the estate, the history, the trust." Margaret came into the room, and settled into a high-backed chair near the window, with the ease of someone returning to a familiar position. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at Clara with those silver eyes, watchful, measuring, deciding something. "Ashbourne has been in my husband's family for 300 years, she said. "It was granted by royal charter and held under a trust arrangement that is by design unusual. The estate is not merely property. It carries with it the guardianship of a significant charitable fund established by the 4th Duke in 1802, added to by every subsequent holder of the title, and currently worth." She paused, and her voice was very level when she continued, "rather a great deal." "How much?" "More than Crane's consortium of creditors, more than the supposed debts they claim the estate owes, more, in fact, than almost anyone connected with this business knows, because the fund is private, held in a separate trust, and the documentation for its existence is kept here, in this library, in a specific form that requires a specific key to interpret." Clara was very still. "A key?" "Not literally," Margaret said. "A document, a companion volume. A book that appears, to anyone who doesn't know what they're looking at, to be simply another entry in the estate's historical records. But to someone who understands the trust structure," she stopped. "Where is it?" Clara asked. "I don't know," she said. "It was here. I saw it 3 months ago, and then, when I looked for it, it was gone." The weight of secrets. They spent the next 2 hours in the library. Margaret talked, and Clara listened, the way she had always listened, completely, quietly, storing everything. She heard about the Duke's father, James Ashbourne, who had been a man of enormous energy and enormous silences, who had built the charitable fund as his life's purpose, and had trusted his wife to protect it, because he had known, in the way that men who truly see their partners know, that she was more capable than anyone around her understood. She heard about the years after his death, the estate's debts, real debts, honestly accumulated, not invented, and the way those debts had attracted people who smelled weakness and came circling. She heard about Aldous Crane, who had appeared 18 months ago, with a briefcase and a letter of introduction, and a carefully constructed story about representing a consortium of sympathetic creditors who wanted to help the family find a solution. She heard about Marcus, the Duke, Margaret's son. She said his name carefully, the way one says, the name of something painful, not avoiding it, but aware of it, handling it like something that still had edges. He was not always cold, she said. He was a warm child, curious. He followed his father everywhere and asked questions until everyone around him begged for silence. A pause. He changed when his father died. They all do, children who lose a parent they idolized. But Marcus went further. He withdrew. He went abroad for business, he said, managing the family's foreign interests. And he has been managed from a distance ever since. Our correspondence is civil. It is not warm. Does he know about Crane? He knows there are creditors. He does not know the full extent of what Crane is attempting. I did not. Another pause. I did not want to appear to him as someone who could not manage her own affairs. It is a foolish vanity. I am aware of that. Clara thought about this for a moment. Then she said, carefully, "You were trying to protect him from worrying." Margaret looked at her. "I was trying," she said quietly, "to protect myself from being seen as someone who needed saving. A beat. There is a difference. Yes," Clara thought. "There is." She turned back to the shelves. She began systematically and methodically to examine the volumes in the section the Duchess indicated historical estate records, bound in dark green leather, numbered by year. She pulled them out one by one, checked the spines, checked the title pages, checked the condition of the binding. She found nothing on the first pass. On the second pass, she found something else. It was not the missing volume. It was a gap, where a volume should have been the gap itself invisible, until she counted the years, and found one missing, not from the most recent years, but from 1802. the exact year the fund was established, the year the fourth Duke had done the thing that changed everything. Someone had taken the right volume, and they knew exactly which one to take. Clara stood in the library with this knowledge, settling into her like cold water, and understood that they were not dealing with ordinary creditors and ordinary debt. They were dealing with someone who had done their research, someone who had studied this estate from the inside out before they made their move. She turned to find the Duchess watching her from the high-backed chair. "You found the gap," Margaret said. It was not a question. "Yes, I found it 3 weeks ago, after looking for the companion volume for 2 months. Clara came and sat in the chair across from her. They looked at each other in the afternoon light, the library warm and silent around them, full of voices that had not yet spoken. "We need to find another way to prove the fund exists," Clara said. "Yes. And we need to do it before the auction. 17 days. 17 days. Clara looked at the shelves. She looked at the old woman across from her, sitting in her chair with her extraordinary posture and her silver hair, and her eyes that had seen more than most people would ever understand. Then she said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning. Every document, every seal, every letter, everything your husband ever showed you about how the fund was structured. We will find another way in." The Duchess looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "No one has asked me that in a very long time. I'm asking you now." And they began. Marcus Ashbourne arrived at his family's estate on a Thursday evening, without warning, which was very much his style. He had sent no letter ahead. He had dispatched no message. He had simply appeared in a travelling carriage pulling through the gates at 6:30, the horses steaming, the man himself stepping out with the controlled, economical movement of someone who had been in motion for a long time, and had learned to hold himself together through sheer discipline. He was 34 years old. He was tall, with dark hair that had been arranged neatly when he left wherever he came from, and was somewhat less neat now, and features that would have been handsome if they were not quite so deliberately composed. His jaw was set, his eyes grey, like his mother's, like the estate itself in winter, moved across the familiar landscape of his childhood home with the expression of a man performing a calculation, not a reunion, a calculation. Clara was in the entrance hall when he arrived. She had been there for 5 minutes, returning a volume to the library that the Duchess had asked her to retrieve, and she had just rounded the corner from the corridor when the front door opened, and Marcus Ashbourne walked into the home. He had not properly inhabited in 4 years. They stopped when they saw each other. He looked at her the way one looks at something unexpected in a familiar place, with a sharpening of attention that contained, barely, the beginning of displeasure. She looked at him the way she looked at most things, steadily, without flinching reading. "Who are you?" he said. His voice was low and precise and not particularly warm. "Clara Weston. I came for the teaching position." "We don't have a teaching position." "Your mother offered me a different arrangement," Clara said. "I've been helping her with some research in the library." Something moved in his expression. The word mother, she thought, landed differently than he wanted it to. "Where is she?" "The parlour, I believe. She was resting." He looked at her for another moment, a measuring look, the same kind his mother had given her, though where Margaret's had softened into warmth. This one remained firmly closed. Then he said, "I see," and walked past her toward the parlour without further acknowledgement. Clara stood in the entrance hall and listened to his footsteps fade down the corridor. Then she exhaled. Well, she thought, that is the Duke, then, mother and son. Through the parlour's half-open door, Clara heard only fragments of what passed between Marcus Ashbourne and his mother, and she was careful not to listen more than was unavoidable. She heard the Duchess's voice, measured and deliberate. She heard the Duke's voice, lower, faster, and then, eventually, quieter. She heard the specific silence that happens in a room when one person has said something that requires the other to reset themselves entirely before they can respond. Then she heard the Duke say, clearly, "Why didn't you tell me?" And his mother says, with equal clarity, "Because I was not ready to." Clara went to the library. She was there for an hour, working through a sequence of estate correspondence that the Duchess had given her access to, letters from the 1800s, dry as dust on the surface and full of illuminating detail beneath. The kind of records that told you everything about how a family had arranged its affairs if you knew what questions to ask. She was looking for secondary references to the charitable fund, any documentation that acknowledged its existence outside of the primary trust deed. Anything that could serve as corroborating evidence. She was so absorbed that she did not hear the Duke until he spoke. "What are you looking for?" His voice came from the doorway. Clara looked up. He was standing with one hand on the doorframe, his jacket removed now, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, which somehow made him seem slightly less like a marble statue and slightly more like a person. His grey eyes were fixed on the papers spread across the table. "Corroborating references to the Ashbourne Charitable Trust," Clara said. "Anything that proves its existence independent of the primary trust deed, which appears to have been removed from the library's records." A pause. Removed. "The 1802 volume is missing. Deliberately, I believe. It's the only one in the historical sequence with a gap. Marcus Ashbourne came into the library." He moved to this other side of the table and looked down at the papers she had spread out, the correspondence, her notes, the careful chronology she had been building for the past several days. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "You have been doing this for how long?" 4 days. "My mother invited a stranger into her home and gave her access to the family's private records." "Your mother," Clara said, keeping her voice entirely level, "invited someone who stepped in when she was being spoken to with deliberate contempt to come inside and help her solve a problem that she has been trying to solve alone for the better part of a year. I would call it good judgment, not impulsiveness." The Duke looked at her. The look lasted a moment too long to be comfortable, and Clara held it not defiantly, but simply because looking away would have been a concession she had no reason to make. "You have opinions," he said. "I have observations. I express them when they are relevant. And you have decided they are relevant here. Someone has forged your mother's signature, stolen a critical document from your family's library, and is proceeding with a fraudulent auction of this estate, on the assumption that no one will look closely enough at the paperwork to notice. In that context, yes, I have decided my observations are relevant." Silence outside. The evening had turned the gardens to blue and gold. Then, slowly, Marcus Ashbourne pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "Show me what you've found," he said. Clara looked at him for a moment, at his jaw, still set, at his eyes, still calculating, at the hands he placed on the table, which were, she noticed, the hands of someone who had done real work in the world. Not idle hands, working hands. She turned a document toward him and began to explain. The house felt different with the Duke in it. It was not simply that his presence filled the rooms in the way any additional person fills a room. It was something more specific than that. Marcus Ashbourne moved through his family home with the careful deliberateness of someone who was both deeply familiar with every corner of it and deeply ambivalent about being there. He knew where the third stair from the top creaked. He knew which windows stuck. He knew the particular quality of light in the library at 7 in the morning. He had mentioned this once in passing, and then looked immediately as though he regretted saying it. He was not, Clara had concluded, a cold man. He was a defender. There was a meaningful difference. The cold man does not care. The defended man has decided at some point that caring costs too much and has arranged his defenses accordingly. The defended man if you are patient and honest and do not pretend his walls are not there, sometimes lets you see around the edges. She was not trying to get around his edges. She was trying to solve a problem. But she noticed things, and she could not unnotice them. What was overheard? On the 5th day after the Duke's arrival, Clara was awake very early. She had taken to working in the library in the hours before the household stirred. The quiet was best then, the light was good, and there was something about the absolute stillness of an old house before dawn that helped her think. She had made considerable progress. She had found 4 secondary references to the charitable fund in the estate's correspondence oblique. But present, she had documented the gap in the historical records with careful precision. She had begun, slowly, to build a case that could stand without the missing volume. She was returning from the kitchen with a cup of tea when she heard the voices. They were coming from the east corridor, a part of the house that was largely unused. The rooms there closed up and sheeted against the dust. Clara stopped. She was in the adjoining corridor, around a corner, and the voices were low but distinct in the early morning silence. One was male, sharp, controlled, Crane. The other was female, cool, precise. A voice Clara had heard only once before on that first afternoon, at a distance, but which she recognized. Vivienne Ashbourne. Clara did not move. She stood very still and listened. The timeline has been moved up, Crane was saying. The auction is in 12 days. There is no longer room for adjustment. There is always room for adjustment, Vivienne said. The question is whether we choose to use it. I do not think we need to. Marcus has arrived. Yes, but Marcus is exactly as I expected him to be. He will spend his time being angry about what should have been done and not paying attention to what is actually being done. He is a man of reactions, not anticipations. And the woman? The Western woman? A pause. Clara heard her own heartbeat. She is an annoyance, Vivienne said. She is working in the library. She is building a case out of correspondence that will not be sufficient. The primary trust deed is gone. Without it, whatever she finds is circumstantial. She cannot prove the fund exists on circumstantial evidence alone. You're certain the volume is secure. It is where I put it, Vivienne said. Which is not in this house. Silence. Then Crane said, and Marcus? When he realizes what has been done, Marcus, Vivienne said, will be too late, as he always is, and when it is over, we will offer him a settlement. The consortium will retain the estate, the fund will be absorbed, and Marcus will be given enough to maintain his dignity and told that this was the only possible outcome. A pause. He will be furious. He will likely never speak to me again, but that is a small price. For what? For everything, Vivienne said simply. For what was always owed to me. Footsteps. Clara pressed herself against the wall and breathed through her nose very slowly. The footsteps receded Crane toward the back of the house, Vivienne in the other direction. Clara stood in the corridor for a long moment. The volume is where I put it. Which is not in this house, not in the house. But close enough for Vivienne to refer to it with that casual certainty, the certainty of someone who could retrieve it if necessary. Clara went back to the library and sat down at the table, and looked at her notes and thought very carefully about what she had just learned. She thought about the fact that Vivienne had access to this house, that she had moved through it freely enough to remove a volume from the library, that she had done this not as an outside agent, but as someone with keys, with knowledge, with a history in these rooms. She thought about what Vivienne had said. What was always owed to me. She thought about how to use this, and then she went to find the Duke. Clara and the Duke, she found him in the garden, which surprised her. She had expected to find him at a desk, reviewing documents, existing in the controlled indoor space that seemed most suited to his particular brand of watchful containment. Instead, he was standing at the far end of the rose garden. The roses were in bloom, running slightly wild, and he was standing among them with his hands in his pockets, looking at nothing in particular, with an expression that was, for the first time since she had known him, unguarded. She stopped a few feet away. He heard her and turned, and the expression was gone, replaced immediately by the familiar, composed attention. "Miss Weston, I need to tell you what I heard this morning," she said. She told him, all of it. He listened without interrupting. His face, as she spoke, went through several changes, none of them dramatic, all of them significant. She watched his jaw tighten and then deliberately relax. She watched his eyes go distant and then come back sharp. She watched, at the mention of Vivienne's name, something move across his face that was not anger, or not only anger, but something older and more complicated, the feeling of a thing confirmed that one had hoped would not be confirmed. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "My sister," he said at last. "Yes. She has been in this house." She took the volume. "She has placed it somewhere off the property, close enough that she feels confident about it, but not here." He turned and looked at the roses for a moment. The morning was still cool, the light still soft, and there was something about standing in the garden of his childhood, home, with this particular information that seemed, Clara thought, to cost him something real. "She wants the fund," he said. "She has always felt she was passed over. When my father structured the trust, he left her a generous settlement, but the guardianship of the fund went to my mother, and then to me. She believed she should have been considered. She made her feelings known. It was not a pleasant time, and you and she have been estranged since then?" "Since then and before, for various reasons." A pause. "We are not a family that has been particularly good at talking to each other." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the roses. His profile was clean and precise, and very slightly tired, and she found, standing here in the garden, with the information between them and the morning light, doing what it always does to an honest face, that she did not find him cold at all. She found him careful. Carefully built, carefully maintained, carefully protecting something he was not yet ready to name. "We have 12 days, she said. He turned to look at her, something in his eyes, a flicker of something she could not immediately identify. "We do," he said, and the word we sat between them in the garden, like a small, significant thing. They worked. There was no other word for what the next 10 days became. Clara and the Duke, side by side in the library from early morning until the light failed, building the case piece by piece from what remained. The Duchess joined them in the afternoons. She would come in with tea, and sometimes with memory, a specific detail recalled, a letter she had forgotten, a conversation she had had with her husband 20 years ago, about the precise language of the trust deed that now, turned over and examined, yielded something useful. She was extraordinary, Clara thought, not despite her age, but because of it. She had stored a lifetime of careful observation, and when you gave her the right question to apply it to, the answers came with the precision of someone who had never stopped paying attention. They were a peculiar team. They knew it. No one mentioned it. Marcus, Clara found, was methodical in a way that complemented her instinctive approach. Where she moved through materials quickly, making connections that she then went back and verified, he moved slowly and thoroughly, examining each document with the care of someone who wanted to understand it completely before moving on. They disagreed, on the third day, about the relevance of a particular sequence of letters from the estate's solicitor, in 1812 Clara, and thought they contained an reference to the fund's existence. Marcus thought she was projecting a connection that wasn't there. They argued about it for 20 minutes, civilly and completely. Then he looked at the letter again and then at her notes and said, "You're right, but for a different reason than you think. Show me." He did. The reference she had identified was circumstantial, but the language used, when compared to a document from 1802 that she had overlooked, was a direct echo, the same legal phrasing used by the same legal hand. Not a coincidence, an acknowledgement. "How did you see that?" Clara asked. "I have read a great deal of legal correspondence," he said. "My life abroad has been largely spent in rooms like this, reviewing papers that determine what belongs to whom." A pause. "It is less depressing when the papers in question are not your own family's." She looked at him. He met her gaze for a moment, and there was something in it that she had not seen before, not warmth exactly, but the very early precondition of warmth. The opening that warmth requires. She turned back to the documents. The seal. It was Clara who found it. She found it on day 11, 3 days before the auction. She had been examining the notice of sale itself, the original document that Crane had presented on that first afternoon, which the Duchess had managed to retain a copy of. Through the simple expedient of having years ago learned to request copies of everything. The copy was not perfect. It had been transcribed by hand, quickly, by Margaret herself, in the minutes after Crane had left, but it was legible, and Clara had been looking at it, off and on, for days. The seal was the thing she could not let go of. The Ashbourne seal, a boar's head with a crown, as the Duchess had described, was stamped in the lower left corner of every official estate document. The Duchess had been clear about its specifics. It was cut from a die made in 1742, the original die still held in the estate's archive, and the impression it made had particular characteristics: a slight irregularity in the crown's right side, a specific depth to the boar's head, a texture in the background that was distinctive to that particular die. The seal on the notice of sale was almost identical. Almost. Clara had been looking at it with a magnifying glass for the better part of an hour when she understood what she was seeing. The irregularity in the crown's right side was wrong. Not absent, but in the wrong position. The original die produced a nick in the upper right. This seal showed the nick in the lower right. It was a small difference. It was the kind of difference you would not notice unless you had spent an extraordinary amount of time studying both the original and the copy side by side. It was the kind of difference that someone who had copied the seal carefully, but from a reproduction rather than from the original die itself, would inevitably produce. She sat very still for a moment. Then she said, "Marcus, he was at the other table." He looked up at her voice, at the particular quality of it, she thought afterward, because she did not normally use his given name. And the word came out with a weight that carried the information before she had spoken it. He crossed the room in a few strides. She put the magnifying glass in his hand and pointed. He looked. He looked for a long time, and then he said, in a voice that was very quiet and very certain, "That is not our seal, no. This document is forged. Yes. All of it. All of it." He straightened. He looked at her, and something happened in his face. Something significant and visible, a shift in the architecture of a face that had been very carefully arranged not to shift. Something opened, something that had been closed for a very long time. "Miss Weston," he said, and then stopped, and then said, "Clara, you have just saved this estate." Clara looked at the seal. Then she looked at him. "We need to bring this to a proper legal authority before the auction," she said. "We need someone who can verify the discrepancies officially. We have 3 days." He was still looking at her. Then he said, "I know who to call. I need to send letters tonight." "Then send them." "You haven't eaten since this morning." This surprised her. She had not expected him to have noticed. "I was working. I noticed," he said. "I notice things." They looked at each other in the library, in the evening light, with the magnifying glass on the table between them, and the forged seal, and 3 days, and everything that was and was not yet said. "Thank you," he said, quietly, as though it cost him something. She understood that it did. That evening, Clara sat alone in the garden until the stars came out. She was not given to long periods of simply sitting. She was a person of movement, of occupation, of the productive use of available time. But the day had been the kind of day that required sitting afterward, the kind that gives you something large and sets you down with it, and asks you to let it settle. She was thinking about the seal, about what it meant that she had found it, about the particular series of circumstances that had brought her from a coach stop at the end of a country lane to a library table in an old manor house with a magnifying glass in her hand, and the precise moment of understanding that a document was not what it claimed to be. She was also, if she was honest with herself, thinking about the Duke, about the way he had said her name, about the thing that had moved in his face, that opening, that shift in a face she had been watching for nearly 2 weeks now, learning its grammar and its silences, about the particular quality of his attention, which was formidable and focused, and which, when it settled on her, felt less like being evaluated and more, lately, like being seen. She heard footsteps on the garden path. "I thought you were writing letters," she said without turning. "I finished," Marcus said. He came and stood near her, not beside her, but near her, which was a distinction that registered. He looked up at the same sky she was looking at. "The letters have been dispatched. The man I've written to is the finest document examiner in England. He will come if I ask him to. He will come quickly if I tell him why. Good. He will be here the day before the auction. Then we have time." A pause. The garden was very quiet. The roses were dark shapes against a darker sky, and somewhere in the old oaks beyond the garden wall, an owl had made itself known. "Miss Weston," Marcus said, and then corrected himself. "Clara," as though he had decided something. "I owe you an apology." She turned to look at him. He was watching the garden with that profile clean, precise, tired in a way that showed only at the edges. "When I first saw you in the hall," he said, "I assumed you were someone who had found an opportunity in my mother's situation, someone taking advantage of an isolated and vulnerable woman. I thought you had some angle, some reason for being here beyond what you stated." "You thought I was an opportunist," Clara said. "Yes. And now?" He turned to look at her then. The moonlight was not generous. It was enough, barely, to see by, enough to see his expression, which was as direct and as undefended as she had ever seen it. "Now I think," he said, "that my mother has better judgment than I do, and that the man who is best positioned to identify the character of a stranger is the one who is honest enough about his own errors to acknowledge them." Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Why did you stay away? From the estate, from your mother, all this time?" He was quiet. She thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because every time I came back, I saw my father everywhere. In the library, in the garden, on the way she set her hands in her lap and looked at me. I was not good at bearing it. I told myself I was managing things from a distance. I told myself that was sufficient." A pause. "I was wrong." Clara looked at him. He was looking at the garden, but she did not think he was seeing it. She thought he was seeing something further away than that, something interior and old. "He sounds like someone worth missing," she said. "He was," Marcus said simply. They stood in the garden for a little while longer without speaking. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was, Clara thought, the kind of silence that only exists between people who have stopped performing something and are simply present. She was not sure exactly when that had happened. She was not sure, either, what it meant for anything that came after. She knew only that it was real, and that real things had a weight and a warmth that could not be manufactured, and that she had not felt the particular version of that warmth in a very long time. "It's late," she said finally. Yes, neither of them moved for another moment. Then she said, "You should sleep. Tomorrow we will prepare for the examiner's arrival." "I know." He offered his arm, which was perhaps unnecessary. They were 30 yards from the house. The path was well kept, and she was perfectly capable of navigating it alone. She took it anyway. They walked back to the house in the dark, through the garden that smelled of old roses, and Clara thought about what was fragile and what was not, and whether the things that were fragile were precisely the things most worth protecting. What the Duchess saw Margaret Ashbourne was not in the habit of watching from windows. It was not dignified, and dignity was something she had maintained at considerable personal cost for most of her adult life. But she was awake when her son and Clara Weston came back from the garden, and she was passing through the upstairs corridor when they entered the front door below her, and she looked down through the railing at the top of the stairs and saw them. Saw the way Marcus offered his arm, saw the way the young woman took it, saw the particular manner in which two people walk, who have discovered, without discussing it, that they are comfortable in each other's company. Margaret stood very still on the landing. Then she went back to her room. She sat in the chair by her window. She looked at the garden, which was dark and quiet and full of roses that had outlasted everything, and would outlast everything still. "James," she said softly, to the room, to the night, to the memory that lived more fully in these rooms than anywhere on earth. "I think you would have liked her very much." She sat for a while longer. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in a long time she slept easily. 2 days before the auction, Aldous Crane moved. He had been watching the manor with the patient attention of a man who has learned that patience is simply a form of weapon. Deployed at the right moment, aimed at the right target, it is more effective than anything louder. He had noticed the Duke's arrival. He had noticed Clara Weston's continued presence in the library. He had noticed, because he was careful and observant, that someone in that house was looking more closely at his paperwork than was supposed to happen. He moved the auction date forward by 24 hours. The notice arrived by courier on a Wednesday morning. It was addressed to the Duchess and handed to the household's one remaining footman, who brought it immediately to Marcus, who was at the library table with his sleeves rolled up and an expression Clara had learned to read as deep focus. He opened it. He read it. Then he set it down on the table with a very deliberate, very controlled movement. "He's moved the date," he said. "The auction is tomorrow, not the day after." Clara looked up from the document she was holding. "Your examiner arrives this afternoon. He will have one evening to assess the seal." Marcus stood. He moved to the window and stood there for a moment looking out, and Clara watched the line of his back and the quality of his stillness, and understood that he was angry genuinely, deeply angry, and was containing it with the effort of someone who had made a lifelong habit of containing things. "Will he have enough time?" Clara asked. "Yes," he said. "He is very good." A pause. "The question is whether Crane has arranged for the auction to proceed, even if challenged." "He will have," Clara said. "He has planned this carefully. He will have someone positioned to push the sale through, even if we present evidence on the day." Marcus turned. His eyes were very direct. "Then we need more than the seal." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." She put down the document and picked up her notes. "The fund. We cannot produce the primary trust deed because Vivienne has it. But I found something yesterday, in the correspondence sequence, something I want you to look at." He came back to the table. She spread her notes in front of him. "There are 4 independent references to the fund in the estate correspondence. The most significant is this one." She pointed, from 1831. "The estate's solicitor at the time wrote to the family's bank in London about the annual distributions from, and I'm quoting directly here, the trust established in 1802 for philanthropic purposes, per the 4th Duke's intention. He references an account number. He references a bank." Marcus looked at the note, then he looked at her. "The bank, if the account still exists, if there are records, even if the account was closed, there would be historical records. Banking houses keep everything." He was already moving. "I need to make a call. The bank is Whitmore and Sons. I know them. Their London office has a direct telegraph line, Marcus." He stopped. She was looking at him with an expression that was steady and frank, and contained, below its surface. Something that was not entirely professional. "Be careful with Vivienne today," she said. "She will know you are close to something. She is very intelligent, and she has been planning this for a long time." Something shifted in his face. "She is my sister. Yes, and she is also the person who took the volume from this library and has arranged a fraudulent auction of your family home. Those things are both true simultaneously. Don't let one make you forget the other." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, very quietly, "You are the most direct person I have ever met. Is that a complaint?" "No," he said, "it is not." He held her gaze for a moment, the particular kind of held gaze that is not a stare, but a decision. Someone choosing to stay rather than look away, and then he went to make his telephone call. And Clara went back to her documents, and the morning turned toward afternoon, and the afternoon turned toward the evening, and the examiner arrived at 6 o'clock, and everything became very precise and very certain, and very close. The examiner, his name was Dr. Edmund Foss. He was 70 years old, spare and sharp-eyed, and he carried his materials in a bag that looked older than most of the buildings he visited. He spoke rarely and with great precision, and when he set the forged notice of sale and the estate's genuine seal side by side in the library, he was quiet for so long that Clara began to wonder if he had fallen asleep with his eyes open. Then he said, "The die used to produce the seal on this document was made within the last decade. The genuine die has characteristics of long-use specific wear patterns, a deepening of the background texture from repeated impression. These are absent here. Additionally, as noted, the crown irregularity is displaced." A pause. "This document is a forgery. I will write my report tonight. I can have it ready by 9 in the morning. "The auction is at 11, Marcus said. "Then you will have your report by 9, Foss said, with the serenity of a man who had never in his life failed to meet a deadline. He put his materials back in his bag. "I would also suggest, Your Grace, that you contact the relevant legal authorities tonight. This is not merely a civil matter. Forgery of title documents is a criminal offense. You will want someone with the appropriate authority present tomorrow." Marcus looked at Clara. Clara looked at the document. "Send it to the magistrate," she said. "Tonight." "I already have," he said. "He will be there in the morning." She looked at him. He was looking at her with that expression. The one she had started to learn. The one that was very slightly warmer than he intended it to be. The one he had stopped making an effort to suppress in the last few days. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will require all of us." "I know. Clara." She waited. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he stopped, started again. "I am grateful that you walked through that gate." She stood in the library with the evening all around her and looked at this man who had spent 4 years keeping the world at careful distance, and was now, in a small and real way, not doing that. "So am I," she said, and she meant it entirely. The morning of the auction arrived with the kind of weather that seems to understand the weight of a moment clear and cold, the sky above Ashbourne a deep, clean blue, the kind of sky that offers no softening comfort and expects none in return. Clara was awake at 5. She dressed carefully. She gathered her notes, every document, every reference, every page of the careful case she had been building for 2 weeks, and carried them downstairs and placed them on the library table and looked at them for a moment. Then she went to the kitchen, made tea, and brought a cup to the Duchess, who was already awake and already dressed in her black, sitting in the parlour with the straightest back and the steadiest hands that Clara had ever seen on a woman, facing the possible loss of her home. "How are you?" Clara asked. "Old," Margaret said, "and angry, and very much looking forward to what comes next." She looked at Clara. "Sit with me for a moment." Clara sat. The Duchess looked at her with those silver eyes that had been watching the world for a very long time and had not, in all that time, stopped seeing it clearly. "When this is over," she said, "and it will be over today, In our favor, I want you to know something. You came here a stranger, for a position that did not exist, and you gave this family something it had been missing for a long time. Not just the legal work. Not just the discovery you made in the library. A pause. You brought my son back. Not physically, he was already here, but back. To himself, to this place. To the possibility of something other than that extraordinary controlled isolation he built, and moved into like a man furnishing a fortress. She looked at Clara with great directness. You are not responsible for that. I am not assigning it to you as a burden. I am simply telling you that I see it, because I suspect no one else will say it, and it deserves to be said. Clara was quiet for a moment. Then she said, He is a good man. He has been afraid. Yes, Musgrave said. He has been afraid. All the men in this family have been afraid of one thing or another, and none of them were particularly good at admitting it. A very slight smile. His father took 11 years to tell me he loved me. 11. I had decided, at year 9, to simply tell him myself. He was so relieved he cried. Clara laughed a real laugh, the involuntary kind. The Duchess's smile widened, briefly and entirely. Go, she said. It is time. The auction. The auction hall that had been arranged in the county town was a large room in the county chambers building, wood-panelled and high-ceilinged and smelling of old paper, and people who had been in rooms like this for decades. By 10 o'clock it was full of county officials, prospective bidders, representatives of the creditor consortium, legal observers, and, clustered near the back of the room, a collection of people whose primary purpose was unclear, but whose presence made the room feel watched. Crane was already there when Clara arrived with Marcus and the Duchess. He was standing near the front of the room in a conversation with two men Clara did not know, and when he saw them enter, his expression did not change, but something in his posture did, a very slight tightening, a recalculation. Vivian was there too. She was standing apart from Crane, which was wise of her, wearing pale blue and pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, and an expression of exquisite composure. When her brother walked in, she met his eyes once, briefly, and something passed between them that was not a greeting. The magistrate, who had indeed arrived that morning, and had spent 2 hours with Marcus and Doctor Foss, and was now standing near the right side of the room with the quiet authority of a man who knows exactly what he is there for, caught Marcus's eye and nodded once. Dr. Foss's report was in Marcus's inner pocket, the bank's telegram confirming the existence of historical records pertaining to the Ashbourne Charitable Trust, which had arrived at 8:45 that morning, 45 minutes ahead of schedule, because the Whitmore and Sons Bank kept extraordinary records, was in Clara's bag, and Clara herself was standing very straight, very still, with the case she had built page by page and day by day under her arm ready. The auctioneer called the room to order. Crane rose immediately and presented his documentation. He was smooth, practiced, and unhurried, the performance of a man who had rehearsed this moment many times and trusted his preparation. The notice of sale, the signed relinquishment of rights, the consortium's formal offer. Each document placed before the auctioneer with the ceremonial precision of someone who believed the process was already complete. The gavel was raised. Clara stood up. The exposure. I would like to raise an objection before this sale is concluded, she said. Her voice carried clearly across the room. She had not needed to shout. She simply spoke the way her father had taught her from the center of herself, directly, without apology. The room shifted. The auctioneer looked at her. Crane looked at her. Vivienne, across the room, did not look at her, which was, Clara thought, itself a form of looking. On what basis? The auctioneer asked. On the basis that the documentation supporting this sale includes at least one forged instrument, Clara said. Specifically, the estate seal used to authenticate the notice of sale does not correspond to the genuine Ashbourne die. The discrepancy has been assessed by Dr. Edmund Foss. a document examiner of 40 years' experience, whose formal report is available for review. She held up the report. Additionally, the sale is predicated on the assumption that the Ashbourne estate is insolvent. New evidence has emerged suggesting the existence of a substantial charitable trust fund attached to the estate, independent of its debt obligations, which materially alters the financial picture. She placed the bank's telegram on the table in front of the auctioneer. The room was very quiet. Crane was on his feet. His composure had not broken. It was stronger than that, but it had, very slightly, shifted. This is a procedural disruption orchestrated by interested parties who, Mr. Crane, the magistrate's voice, steady, official, final. I have reviewed the document examiner's report, and I am satisfied that there is sufficient cause to suspend this sale pending a criminal investigation into the authenticity of the documentation submitted. The sale is stayed. The gavel did not fall. In the subsequent 10 minutes, the room went through several stages, loud, then louder, then suddenly and absolutely quiet. Crane's consortium representatives were in urgent conversation. The auctioneer was conferring with the county official seated beside him. The magistrate was moving toward Crane with the unhurried certainty of someone who has decided what happens next. And in the middle of it all, Marcus Ashbourne crossed the room to where Clara was standing with her papers and her notes, and the steady certainty of someone who had done the work and found the truth and said it out loud, and he stood in front of her, and he said, "Clara." She looked at him. "You saved her. You saved this." He stopped. The room was loud around them, and he was very close, and his voice was very quiet and very direct. "You came for a teaching position. I found a more interesting occupation," she said. Something happened to his face. The last wall, she thought, or the last of the last wall, the thing that had been held in place by habit and grief, and the long discipline of a man who has decided that the world is safer if kept at a manageable distance. It did not collapse. She would not have wanted it to collapse. It simply opened. Like a door at last, at the right moment, to the right person. He took her hand. In the middle of a crowded room, with the legal proceedings swirling around them, and his mother watching from 20 feet away with an expression of extraordinary composure, and something that might, if examined closely, have contained the very faintest trace of satisfaction, Marcus Ashbourne took Clara Weston's hand and held it. "Stay," he said, simply, without the architecture of explanation. Clara looked at him. At this house that had become, in 2 weeks, more familiar than any place she had lived in years. At the woman across the room who had said, "I think the position may be filled," the very first time they met and had known, with the unerring instinct of someone who pays very close attention, exactly what she meant by it. "I am staying," she said. "I believe I already decided that." Reckoning Vivian Ashbourne did not run. She was too composed for running and too proud for it. She was still standing near the back of the room when the magistrate's assistant came to speak with her, and she received him with the same exquisite composure with which she had conducted herself all morning. She answered questions. She was very careful and very controlled. She did not, at any point, raise her voice. She looked at her brother once, across the room. Marcus looked back at her. It was not an angry look. It was something older than anger, the complicated grief of a person who has spent a long time hoping that the story of someone they love will turn out differently than it is turning out. She looked away first. The proceedings that followed would unfold over months. Legal proceedings are rarely swift, and the business of unraveling a fraud constructed over 18 months with this level of deliberateness required considerable time and effort. The primary trust deed, the 1802 volume, was recovered from a property Vivienne had been renting in the adjacent county. The Ashbourne Charitable Trust was formally verified. The estate's actual financial position, once the inflated debt claims of Crane's consortiums, were stripped of their fraudulent elements, was manageable, not comfortable, but manageable, and the Trust's resources provided options that had not previously existed. Crane was charged. The proceedings were not swift, but they were thorough. Vivienne was not charged with forgery. Her precise role was harder to prove, but the trust settlement her father had established for her was reviewed and restructured as part of the legal process, and she withdrew from county life entirely and was not, for a very long time, seen in those rooms again. The estate did not go to auction. The notice came down from the gate on the afternoon of the day the auction was stayed, removed by the footman under Marcus's instruction, and the gate was oiled and the chain removed, and the path beyond it was open again, the way it had presumably been for most of 300 years before someone with a grudge and a briefcase had decided to close it. What remained the summer came to Ashbourne the way summer always does, slowly, and then everywhere at once, the gardens going from careful to exuberant in the space of 2 warm weeks, the roses finally given to full bloom, the lawns full of long light in the late evenings. Clara did not leave. She stayed, as she had said she would, in the arrangement that had no particular formal title, but which everyone in the house understood perfectly. She worked with the Duchess on the library, cataloguing properly, filling gaps, restoring what could be restored. She worked with Marcus on the estate's revival. There was a great deal to be done, and she discovered, in the doing of it, that her habit of seeing clearly and speaking directly was not merely useful in crises, but was in fact the kind of thing a large, complicated, living household needed on a daily basis. She and Marcus did not rush toward each other. They were both, in their way, people who had learned to be careful of grief and discipline, from years of moving through a world that did not always make room for her. They moved toward each other the way 2 people do who have decided to be honest and are finding out, incrementally, and with some surprise, that honesty makes everything both harder and better. He told her, on an evening in July, standing in the garden where they had first talked properly about his father. The real version is not the composed grief of someone managing an impression of loss, but the raw version, the version of a boy who had adored someone and lost him, and did not know what to do with the world after. He talked for a long time, and she listened the way she always listened, completely and without interruption. And when he stopped, she simply took his hand, the same way he had taken hers in the auction hall. Without architecture, without a preamble, he looked at her. "You know," he said, "I have been told, at various points in my life, that I am difficult." "You are," she said. "So am I." "I know," he said, and there was something in his voice that was entirely warm, that was not defended at all, that was simply him, the him that had been there all along under all the careful construction. "I find I prefer it to the alternative." She looked up at him in the garden light. "Don't take 11 years, she said. He laughed. It was a real laugh, the kind that happens involuntarily, the kind that surprises the person laughing, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up, made him look younger and realer, and more himself. She thought she would like to hear that laugh for a very long time. "No," he said, "I won't." And he didn't. Margaret. The Dowager Duchess of Ashbourne lived for another 18 years after the auction that did not happen. She spent them in the house she had protected, and the library she loved, and the garden that persisted beautifully, without permission. She was not a soft woman, she never had been, would never be, but she was a present one, a paying attention one, and the household around her noticed that she smiled more easily in those later years, moved more freely, spoke of her husband with something that was not grief so much as affectionate companionship, as though he was still present in the rooms they had shared, and she had simply gotten better at talking to him. She adored the children. She would not have described it that way, because she found the word adore excessive, but the children knew it. The way children know things, the way they orient themselves toward warmth, the way flowers orient toward light. She read to them in the library in the evenings from the volumes she loved, and she answered every question they asked, no matter how complicated, because she believed as firmly as she had ever believed anything, that a child who is taken seriously becomes an adult who takes seriously. She died in the house on a December morning, peacefully and completely, with her son and her daughter-in-law present, and the library unlocked, and the gate at the end of the drive standing open. She had not, in 18 years, permitted it to be closed again, and that is the story of Clara Weston, who came to a gate with a notice nailed to it and walked through anyway. She had come looking for a teaching position. She found something harder and rarer than that. A family that needed someone willing to see it clearly, and a man who had built very careful walls and discovered, against his own expectation, that the right person can make you glad you finally left the door. She found that kindness is not the same as softness, that standing up for someone you don't know, in the moment it costs you something, is one of the most powerful things a person can do, that the truth is almost always findable, if you are patient enough and honest enough and willing to look at the things other people are pretending not to see. She found that the walls people build around themselves are almost always made of something grief or fear or the very particular pain of having loved someone enormously and lost them, and that understanding what a wall is made of is the first and most essential step toward being the kind of person someone eventually lets past it. She found, though she did not set out to find it, though it was not on her list, though she had arrived at those gates with a brown leather trunk and a letter of application and sensible shoes and no particular plan for love, she found that too. And it was, as these things always are when they arrive at the right time and the right gate, entirely unexpected and entirely right. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. Every story we tell carries inside it a set of beliefs about how the world works and how people ought to move through it. This one believes that kindness is an act of courage and that the decision to help a stranger in a moment when it would be far easier to walk past is not a small thing but a consequential one. Clara Weston did not know who Margaret Ashbourne was when she stepped forward. She did not intervene because it was advantageous. She intervened because she recognized something wrong and decided, in the fraction of a second that such decisions take, that she was not willing to pretend she hadn't seen it. This story also believes that the people who build walls around themselves are not cold, they are hurt, that the distance a person keeps from the world is almost always a measure of how much the world has cost them, and that the most courageous thing is not to never be hurt, but to be hurt, and to let the wall down anyway for the right person at the right time. It believes that pride in families, in relationships, in any human connection is expensive, and compounds its cost with time, that the longer we wait to tell the people we love what we feel, the more we pay for the silence. And it believes perhaps most of all that the truth, however buried, however carefully hidden, however thoroughly disguised, does not disappear. It waits, and if you are patient and honest and willing to look at small details with great attention, you will find it. You always find it.